The ease of control. Control is very important to one such as I. Control is necessary because of being subjected to a lack of control environment that it creates a hypersensitivity to those threats. The issue of control is fundamental as part of the prime aims that the narcissist seeks, but it is also relevant with regard to my psychopathy, because to be able to control people allows the playing of games, means that the aims and goals that I have, where people appear, they must be controlled to ensure that they do what I require so that I can achieve those goals and aims, or that they are controlled in a way so as to remove them from getting in the way of my goals, from getting in the way of my aims. By controlling those individuals, I'm also able to find entertainment in causing them to do what I want to do, to behave in a particular way. And thus, my need for control is twofold. The first is the necessity of having it with regard to nullification of threat control and maintenance of it because of my narcissism, but also to achieve my aims. Others that have antisocial personality disorder don't necessarily need the control to the extent that some of us do. They're more haphazard in the way that they go about things. How is this control achieved? How is it the ease of control? Well, there are thousands of different ways of controlling people, but essentially, one, it comes down to two things: fear and reward. The old carrot and the stick, the honey and the vinegar. I'm not going to address the issue of reward in this video when it comes to the ease of control. I'm going to be talking about fear, and I'm going to start with the issue of death, because fear of dying is, without doubt, the greatest fear that the greatest number of people will have. There will, of course, be some people who don't fear death. They would have something else that would cause them to be frightened. Indeed, there be some people who perhaps have been ill for a long time, in pain and suffering, and they would welcome the sweet, sweet relief that death would bring. But if we look at the human race as a whole, and we were to ask, what is the one thing that you fear the most? The answer that would be given the most times is a fear of dying. And therefore, understanding that is important to enable me to use this fear of death as a means of control. And in so doing, it necessitates understanding attitudes towards death. Because by understanding the way that people perceive death, understand death, regard death, at every level and strand, enables me to be more effective in my application of how I use it to achieve the ease of control. Death is a state of total disappearance of life. Dying is a process of decay of the vital system which ends with clinical death. In modern medicine, the flat line in the record of an EEG or lack of brain function is most commonly considered as a criterion of death. Death is an irreversible cessation of the functions of organs that are necessary for life. Until the end of the 19th century, the issue with death and dying was the area of interest first and foremost of the philosophy, religion, and medicine. Among the pioneers of research on death and dying in the social sciences were Sigmund Freud and Emily Durkheim. The primary wave of scientific interest in the non-medical aspects of death actually only occurred in the 1960s, with publications of research on the social reaction to death and on the interactions of dying people with the environment. It's important for me to study these things, to understand them, to enable me to harness them by understanding how you regard death, so that I can utilize that for the ease of control. There are clinical approaches, humanistic approaches, psychological ones, anthropological ones, and sociological ones. A clinical approach focuses on caring for a dying patient. It looks at the patient-clinician relationship, negotiation with the caregiver team, the establishment of a plan. The humanistic orientation includes at least 3 different concepts of death: essentialism, existentialism, and culturalism. Death also has a prominent place in the philosophical concepts and theories. There's even the traditional view that philosophizing is thinking and meditation on death, because death is a reference point for discussion of the most important questions about the meaning of life. The philosophical perspective focuses on topics such as the definition of death, questions about immortality, the harm of death, and moral and ethical issues. In the history of death, it was perceived in various ways. For instance, the Epicureans proved that if there is death, then I do not exist, and if I am living, then death does not exist. Thus it cannot be so experienced, and this means that there is nothing to worry about for humans. Similarly, Socrates saw no point in the fear of death, since the death of the body is not important when there is a soul, and it will be released at the time of the death of the body. Death was also treated very seriously. For example, Plato concluded that philosophizing was simply a preparation for dying and death. Much later, Descartes, as the father of modern philosophy in the 17th century, introduced the concept of substance. He saw death only as the end of carnality, while after the death of the body, the human remains a thinking substance. A continuation of this vision was described by Spinoza. He emphasized that wisdom should be seen in reflections about life, not about death. The existentialists in the 20th century understood the meaning of death in a similar fashion. For them, awareness of mortality was the basis for a full life that should be an important topic to think about for everyone. The existentialists, by rejecting the objectivity, emphasized the value of the individual. Søren Kierkegaard, one of the most influential representatives of existential philosophy, believed that people moving away from their own I are falling into despair. He divided despair into 2 forms. The first is the despair of infinity, otherwise known as fantasy. People flee into a world of fantasy by an escape from reality and their existence, which leads them to delve into the imaginary life. The second type of despair is the despair of finitude. You see, the real world scares people, which leads them to plunge into the real world and just to become a cog in the existing world. I recognize that very few people have the ability to choose at the right moment the appropriate and the most important purpose in life, and even at the risk of losing other purposes, they can seek to achieve this single and most important goal. Death is a necessary and irreversible process, while life is suspended between nothingness before life and nothingness after life. Death exists in life and gives meaning to life. If there were no death, there would be no life. Awareness of the finiteness of life gives meaning to life as a challenge and task. Meanwhile, mortality is that condition with which everyone must be reconciled, because it is a natural state of affairs. You see, by understanding the way that people regard death, and I've only just scratched the surface, there's much more for me to tell you about this, and I shall be doing so, but by understanding the way that people regard death, I bolt on those character traits, that understanding about people, by getting deep within them by learning from others as to how they view death, the philosophers, the anthropologists, the sociologists, the way that they talk about death. I'm able to distill the collective information that they have acquired over all of these years to frame my understanding of what death means to people. The stigmas associated with it, the joy that might come from it, the fear associated with it. By examining all of those layers, by peeling it, by getting under the bonnet, by taking it apart and reconstructing it once again, I am able to gather such a huge understanding of how that fear associated with death gives me such a broad control. That is why, as the Ultra, it enables me to understand so much that I can then apply, that I can understand what's going on inside that mind. As I assert control over that person, that I know that there is that fear way within, and that I know the various ways that that fear functions, what it is linked to in association with the dealing with death, the death of others, and the death of that person. And all of that aids me in the ease of my control. This is part of my hyper-focus, of my psychopathy, to have such a rich and detailed understanding of the subject of death, and then to use it, both in terms of the prime aims linked to my narcissism, but also, more importantly, with regard to my psychopathy. For by understanding you, and everybody else like you, affords me the ease of control over you, and that which marks me out as the Ultra. Join me in the next video as I continue to share with you what I have learned in relation to the way that death is viewed, the way that dying is viewed, and how I use that as the Ultra.